Halfway between El Paso and Fort Worth lies Midland, Texas, a booming oil town with a population of just over 100,000 people. A place where Kathy Lujan hopes her dreams can come true.
What are we doing here, Dad?
She just wanted stability. She just wanted to have the white picket fence, married.
Well, bank gave me the keys early. It's all yours, son.
Thank you, Dad.
And with her father's help, this young divorcee's life begins to turn around.
Her dad helped her to purchase a home, beautiful home.
She said, Daddy's little girl. Daddy will always protect her and take care of her. Whatever she needs, he will make sure it is provided for her.
Kathy's father may have her back, but she's ready to strike out on her own.
Kathy was well known as the cookie lady.
These are freshly baked.
She always wanted to be a boss, a manager. She had great ambitions and goals and just wanted to be the best she could be.
Have a nice day.
Raising a kid by herself is a challenge. But when an old flame crosses her path, she remembers what single life is all about.
Kathy?
Wow,
Whoa, what's up? It's been a minute.
It's been 5 years, to be precise.
Back in the 90s, there was a thriving rap singing here in Midland.
Appreciate you showing up, bro.
Juan was making a name for himself. He was a rapper, so he knows how to approach people, how to talk to people.
Sheesh. What's up? See me throw it down in there?
It was a great show.
Oh, word? You mean that?
For real.
Well, because of that, you should take one of my CDs.
Thank you.
I can see Kathy being attracted to someone who's very confident, who puts himself out there.
Those hurt a lot.
You know, if I got you looking at them, I guess it's worth the pain.
Juan's nothing like Kathy.
She came from a good background. Her brother was a police officer, so, I mean, it was stable.
Juan was complete opposite. He loved to drink, party.
That's so beautiful.
Kinda gangster guy, just a little rough at the edge.
They date for 2 years.
I just can't do it anymore.
What? What are you talking about right now?
The late nights, the drinking, the partying,
Yeah.
drugs.
Come on now. You know, it's all part of the game. I'm not out here just doing that.
It's not part of me. I'm sorry. I just can't do it.
You're being for real right now.
I'm sorry.
Babe, yo. For real?
All she wanted to do was to make a good living and have a good life and, you know, the little family with the dog and take a walk, things, trips and things like that.
Flash forward 5 years.
Full court press, coming for your neck. Free throw, I'd rather get a Why would I play if I could be the ref? So what do you think?
It's great. I love it.
For real?
For real.
Oh, thank you. You know, I've been trying to send out a bunch of demos to producers, just trying to catch the right one to really believe in me, you know. I mean, you believe in me, right? You believe in us?
Kathy believed in Juan. She believed he had promise.
You know, things could be different this time. You know, I'm clean. I'm working. You know, most importantly, I'm ready.
And I do believe in you.
No, hey, I got it, don't worry. It's all good. Relax for a change.
What's up, little man? Oh, we got a diaper situation on our hands. Don't worry, champ. I got you.
She wanted Matthew to have a dad and wanted Matthew to have a normal family.
Oh man, you got an amazing kid. Most importantly, he's so good.
Kathy didn't want to be dating around. She wanted to find that one and just settle. She wasn't a serial dater. She really wanted to find somebody that she could spend the rest of her life with.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell are uncertain about this rekindled romance.
There are a couple of reasons that typically people will go back to an old love. The first is that the love hasn't gone away. But oftentimes there's also a second reason, which is you do develop a comfort with a person when you've been with them. And that sometimes is easier than taking a risk of being with someone else. And I think that that's what's going on here with Kathy.
She's kind of giving Juan a second look, and she's probably hopeful that he's kind of cleaned up his act to the point where she can have the things she liked about him before without the things that concerned her. And sometimes that optimism causes people to kind of overestimate the extent to which somebody's changed.
It doesn't take long for Juan to move right in.
I said, hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama gonna buy you a mockingbird.
He treated Matthew like he was his. He really did. I think he didn't even want Matthew to know that he wasn't his dad.
Mama gonna buy you a mockingbird.
Gonna buy you a what?
A mockingbird. Mama gonna buy you a mockingbird.
Oh, I could just stay here and feed that cute little face all day.
I know, but Mama got to bring home the bacon.
And the baby food.
I know.
So Juan ended up becoming a de facto daycare.
It's a good arrangement.
I think they were in a good spot as far as their relationship, so she wanted to have a child with him at that time.
And eventually, they do. In March 2011, they have a son.
Juan loved that baby. He was so proud of that baby.
So what do you think about Luis?
Oh, he was happy. He was ecstatic.
They're the perfect family.
Oh, yes. Got your favorites here.
Until something gets in the way.
Oh, wait, let me fix your chair.
Chronic back pain makes it almost impossible for Juan to work as a cook.
So he would have to stand on his feet all the time, and it would really aggravate his back.
But that's the least of his problems.
I think he was dealing with it with narcotics.
I'm coming right now.
You know, I guess he was kind of hiding it.
Smells great.
But hiding secrets can only last so long.
Yo!
Wow, you're pathetic.
Kathy decided that there's more to life than Juan.
I think it kind of scared him.
Sweethearts Kathy Lujan and Juan Gonzalez have been together for 13 years. And though Juan's past is troubled, he's cleaned up for his new family. Or so it seems.
Okay, what's next?
If you can... Hey, stay out of that.
Ooh, that's sweet.
Kathy was already working for American Cookie, and she did get him a job there.
Can you just fix these so they look nice, please?
Okay.
I'm gonna get some more trays.
Yep.
He would come help her, or he'd come in for a few hours every day to come help her, just to get extra money.
Extra money to feed his new addiction. With disastrous consequences.
While they're working together, money is missing. And the owner of the cookie company immediately is asking Kathy what happened to it.
We were just going through a really hard time, and I thought I'd be able to pay you back before anyone noticed it. I swear I'll make it right.
And it isn't small change.
Kathy told the owner that she'd stole the $30,000 and that she would pay it back.
Dad, can we talk?
And then Kathy told her father,
I I'm in a bit of trouble. I need your help.
And of course, her father's going to do whatever he needs to do to take care of his daughter, and he actually took out a loan to pay the money back to the cookie store.
It does not seem in character for Kathy to have taken the money because she seems to be a hard worker and the good girl and the person who tries to do everything the right way. Now, the question is, why would she cover for Juan? I think she doesn't want to upset the apple cart. I think she's hoping to keep him on track. She's viewing it as sort of a mistake, and she's going to try and cover and deal with it on his behalf.
She probably is trying to wrap her mind around Juan still being a good person despite the fact that he did something so deceitful, so disrespectful. Maybe Kathy was thinking that there are some things about having Juan in her life and her kids' lives that are good things, and she's not sure if she could get those things again if Juan were to go away, and so she's kind of worried about what her life would be like absent Juan.
At the same time that Kathy is covering for Juan, there has to be something going on inside of her mind. Why would he take a risk and do something like that at a place that she's gotten him a job at and she has a long-term relationship with? And I have to believe that there is something brewing inside of her that will ultimately manifest itself in some type of anger.
Really?
Yo, are you serious?
Are you kidding me? 30 grand in checks?
Please. You've been working there for years. They basically owe you that.
Oh, and that money went to me? Do you see it around here?
Yo!
Wow! You're pathetic.
It's a turning point for Kathy. She quits her job and gets a new one at a grocery store.
Kathy decided that she wanted to better herself, and she decided to work for H-E-B because they had better opportunities for her to move up.
She was very, very proud when they made her a manager.
Kathy, at that point, was able to put herself out there and realize that there's more to life than Juan.
Much, much more.
Well, those look hot.
Actually, they're cool now.
I wasn't talking about the pastry. Boss lady.
But what does Juan think about the new Kathy?
I think it kind of scared him.
Hey,
I really do.
where you been? Hello? I'm talking to you.
I think he worried that someone else would be attracted to her.
So it's like that.
Someone else would take her away from him.
What is wrong with you? Ever since you started this management BS and this weight loss, what, you think you're someone special?
Well, I can't count on you to make me happy.
It's not my job to make you
can't
happy.
keep any job.
Okay, good. Remember that.
Oh, yeah, that's it. You go. That's your go-to solution.
What's yours, being a bitch?
You know what? We're done.
Good.
She had told Juan that they were done, but however, he could still remain in the house. She couldn't bear throwing Juan out on the streets because if she threw him out, he had nowhere to go.
It really looks to me like Kathy reached the point where she felt like she had outgrown Juan, that he was more of a burden than a partner or somebody that she was enjoying being around.
I think what we're seeing here is Kathy sort of coming full circle. When she first met Juan, she was discerning enough to say, not the right person for me. And so here she is discerning again and realizing, yeah, she was right the first time. He's not a fit for her.
I'm concerned at this point that Juan is looking at Kathy and seeing that she's sort of had this makeover and she's happier now. And if I'm him, I'm gonna be angry. And so I believe that he's gonna wanna retaliate because she's hurt him.
Kathy's transformation leads to something else.
Kathy puts herself out on social media. She had never had an account. She starts to reconnect with some of her friends.
Kathy and Roberto were high school sweethearts. They've known each other for most of their life.
Aren't you a sight for sore eyes? I can't believe I'm messaging you.
And soon their old flame is lit.
They talked, and Kathy would tell Roberto stuff that was going on in her life.
Yeah, I have 2 now.
How she was having difficulties with Juan, and he would comfort her.
And Kathy realizes she has feelings for him.
And those feelings are about to explode.
And she just called me just hysterical.
While Kathy Lujan's home life with Juan Gonzalez is falling apart, she embarks on a new relationship with an old flame.
Well, hi, a guy I haven't seen in a lifetime.
Hi yourself.
Hey, come in.
He lived in San Antonio. She had told me that she had went down there for a meeting and that he had came to her room.
It feels like we're teenagers.
I know, it's like high school all over again.
They started to make a plan, a life plan. And this life plan included moving to San Antonio with the kids, Roberto leaving his wife.
Juan's suspicions are raised.
You've got to be kidding me.
Her dad had left the money for her to pay Luis's daycare, and he stole it.
This is not happening.
She just called me just hysterical. Like, she could not believe.
Juan took the money. $180. I mean, who takes the money for their own kids' daycare?
That was her final straw. She's like, I'm so done. Like, she was livid.
Kathy was finally going to confront Juan about stealing the money. And she was going to tell him about Roberto. He can have the house, he can stay there, but she and the kids are going to San Antonio with Roberto. Kathy went silent, and that silence caused fear amongst her friends.
Thursday, I was like, why did Kathy call me? You know, I just didn't think anything of it. She's busy, she'll call me back. She never called me back. So Friday, I'm like, what? Okay, what the heck?
I know that Luis was going to be graduating for his little kindergarten class, and she was very ecstatic to be attending, and she never showed up.
She doesn't show up for work either.
She never missed work, ever.
So Kathy's father goes on a mission.
He went over to her house and knocked on the door, and Juan answered.
She hasn't been here. She probably took off with one of the guys she's sleeping with now.
Juan told him that his daughter was admitted to having an affair.
It's been 2 days. It's not like her.
If I can make her come back, I would. And you know that.
You need to call the police.
But maybe she's not gone very far.
You want to see it? There.
Roberto contacted the police department to let us know that he was having a relationship with her.
You got a text from her.
Yeah.
When no one hears from Kathy Lujan for 2 days, friends and family start to panic.
For her not to talk to me, her dad, and then her kids, Kathy would never would she just up and leave without her kids, you know?
Facing mounting concerns, Juan finally files an official report.
Juan called the police department to report his wife missing. At that point, they contacted me because I was the on-call detective.
Tell me when and where you last saw her.
Well, we had a fight, and she told me she had an affair. She just left. But no one heard anything since. That was Wednesday.
Wednesday. Can you give me the contact information for some of her friends or family? Paul?
There's only a Padgett family that I know in Midland. And I immediately knew then that Kathy had to be Paul's sister.
Hey, Mitch.
Paul and I worked at one point together at the Midland Police Department. You know, he's my brother in blue. It just really hit hard when I saw it.
Detective Rodriguez immediately goes to see Juan.
You know, something was off, and I could feel it. So I confronted her. Look, I know something's going on.
I'm just working. Maybe you forget what that is.
Okay, then let me see your phone.
Right? You don't get to police me.
He believed that she was having an affair. At some, like 30 minutes later, Kathy exits the bedroom.
You want to see it?
Yeah.
There.
And hands him her phone.
Copy now?
She admits the affair.
And then at this point, he left.
Kathy?
And when he returned home, she was no longer there, and he believed that she had left with one of the two guys that she was having an affair with.
I mean, look, I've been trying to get a hold of her.
He had shown me his phone text messages and phone calls where he had tried to reach her. But I'm looking at his demeanor. You see some emotion. And I could see that he didn't have any scratches, no defense marks, nothing where he was attacked, nothing like that.
I'll have to go through your house. That's okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
I noticed there were some suitcases. And then that's what drew me the question, like, did she not take anything with her? And then I see a plastic bag. And it has her bank cards, her credit card has her debit cards, credit cards, checkbook, and her driver's license.
Everything but her cell phone. Intrigued, Detective Rodriguez continues the search outside.
This is your vehicle?
Yes, ma'am.
That one's hers?
Yes, ma'am. That's hers.
She left without it.
Yeah, I assumed one of her boyfriends just came and picked her up.
They check Juan's car for blood.
It gets sprayed, and as he's getting sprayed, you saw it light up, and my heart just dropped.
But Rodriguez is well aware that it's not just blood that causes luminol to light up.
We still have to get it tested just to make sure it's not a cleaning agent or anything else that could, like copper, anything copper related that would indicate that it could be something else.
Normally, the process takes up to 6 months, but Detective Rodriguez had asked for a rush.
As she waits for the results, Rodriguez still has no hard evidence. But what she does have is 3 persons of interest: Juan Gonzalez, Peter, the man Kathy flirted with at work, and Roberto.
At this point, I think there's every reason to be concerned that foul play is involved.
I don't see anything in Kathy's history that would lead me to believe that she would just run away. She has tried to still be nice to Juan in terms of the house and letting him stay there, and she seems to be a very doting mother. And frankly, knowing Kathy, I would think that she would have taken them with her.
If you look at these investigations as sort of concentric circles where you've got the missing person at the center, and then you look first at the circle of people who are closest to the person. You look at Juan, and there's not anything that jumps out. So you have to continue looking and progressing out and going, okay, well, who's the next closest person or couple of people? And I think at this point, in addition to Juan, Peter and Roberto need to be looked at and ruled out as well.
It was all over Crime Stoppers. It had hit the media, hit the billboards.
Detective Rodriguez.
Roberto contacted the police department to let us know that he was having a relationship with her.
When did the relationship start?
A month ago. We haven't done anything, though. We've kissed a few times.
The last time I talked to her was that Wednesday. I don't know. I mean, after she had sent me a text around 6:30, and it seemed like her, but it just gotten weirder and weirder for me, you know.
You got a text from her.
Yeah, but it wasn't her. She was using different phrases.
Roberto is texting with Kathy and getting these responses back that are provocative, dirty.
And it just threw me for surprise because, like, we sleeping with me. I said, he ain't been sleeping with me. And then I just got a text like, you know what I mean? And that part, yeah, I mean, that part was, I mean, she knew what we'd done, what we haven't done.
So y'all have never had sex?
No.
And so Roberto, in reading this, knows that the person he's texting with is not Kathy.
And he's able to prove it.
We had this song that we had since years ago, and we were talking about it a couple weeks ago. And once I started getting fishy, I kept asking what the name of the song was, and he didn't never give it to me.
So at that point you knew?
Yeah, I knew it wasn't her.
After that, all communication ceased.
While Roberto's story is compelling, it's still just a story.
It could still be Roberto just trying to, mislead us.
Next, the investigation turns to Peter, Kathy's friend from work.
I'm going to ask you something really personal, and I need you to be really honest with me, okay? What's the relationship between you and Kathy?
Well, before she became the manager, because she was just doing the program, we did from 4 around. Okay. But it was like she was in management now, so it was like, hey, you're going to lose everything. If they find out, you're going to lose everything. Okay. That's why when they asked me, I was like, no. I mean, because if she pops up, I don't want her to lose her job.
Each man is a suspect, and it's only a matter of time before one of them cracks.
We were able to confirm through phone records that Roberto was actually at work.
Next up, Peter.
We were able to confirm that Kathy and Peter had really not had much communication. It had kind of fallen off. As well, that Peter was nowhere near Kathy's house at the time that the phones actually kind of went silent. So Detective Rodriguez goes ahead and gets an order to be able to look at where is Kathy's phone pinging off of? Where's the tower location? We're able to look at Kathy's phone and Juan's phone and realizing that they are pinging off of the same tower at the same time.
It's not a smoking gun, but it's certainly suspicious.
She knew that there was something not right.
But what?
If we don't have a body and we want to do a murder case, what do we need to do?
We had no proof of life.
It's been 2 weeks since anyone has seen Kathy Lujan, and with all other suspects cleared, her partner Juan Gonzalez is the primary suspect. But without a body or a DNA match for the blood in the SUV, police aren't ready to make an arrest. And while the search continues, there's little hope that Kathy is still alive.
After compiling all the information and reviewing everything, I pretty much knew that she was dead. The dad was not wanting to accept it, but I think deep down he knew. I contacted the district attorney. So she had done some research in regards to if we don't have a body and we want to do a murder case, what do we need to do? So we have what is called a proof of life. Has she been pulled over by any law enforcement? And we have to check, did she ever get a new driver's license?
We had no proof of life.
Police turn back to Juan.
We were able to bring him up to the police department. Voluntarily, he came and talked to us, and we put everything out.
You said you got a bunch of texts from Kathy saying she was fine, she just wanted to be left alone.
Nothing happened, Rosie. Nothing happened. I didn't do anything to her.
I think you did. And I'm trying to figure out, was it an accident or did you purposely plan all this out to kill her?
Nope. I didn't make no plans to hurt her.
Well, everything else is showing that you did. And that blood that's going to be in the vehicle is going to be her blood.
Okay, so what do you want me to do?
Tell me where you took her.
I don't know. I didn't take her anywhere, Rosie. Also, I'm done talking to you.
Out of your way.
There's another detective that knew him from his prior history. He had done surveillance and had done some investigation with him, so they have this report already.
I know you, Juan. We know you have her cell phone. And that's really not helping you right now.
Look, fine. I have her cell phone. There's a good reason, okay? I just want to know who she was with. If I call and someone say, hey, you know what, Kathy's here, fine. I know she's safe, okay? She gave it to me. I was waiting for her to come back, then I'll give her phone back. That's it. I don't know.
Based on having the knowledge that we had at the time, Juan was allowed to go back home.
It's a strange story, but not enough to keep Juan at the station. Then, the same day that he's interrogated, Juan Gonzalez is arrested. Not for murder, but for using Kathy's credit card without her knowledge.
Juan was trying to leave town, so we made a decision to go ahead and arrest him.
The arrest is part of a larger strategy.
So we were just kind of hoping that being inside a cell would be enough to kind of tip him over the edge to tell us where Kathy was. Because at that point in time, that's all we wanted. We had no proof of life. We were just waiting on the DNA to get the DNA match. Once we had the match, we didn't need a body. We just wanted to know where she was.
Finally, they get the break they've been waiting for.
The results come back saying it's Kathy's blood, so we knew she was dead. And with the blood, the DA said we can go forward with a case to file murder on him without a body.
What if I told you we're ready to arrest you for murder right now?
Can't just do that. Like, you don't even have a body.
Well, we just found out the blood in the SUV is Kathy's. That's enough.
They have her blood, and there's a problem with the phone, It's called circumstantial evidence. It's like me watching you do it.
It's at that moment that you physically see it on Juan. His body language said it all. That he knew exactly where her body was. Now we just had to get him to tell us. The tactic was, let's give him an out.
Look, Juan, we know there's more to that story. Maybe it's not as bad as it looks.
So I started throwing different ideas at him.
Maybe something happened. Maybe she did it to herself.
And one of the ideas was the suicide.
Juan took the bait, hook, line, and sinker.
All I know is I left the house that day and I got home and she was laying on the kitchen. She was laying down face first. I turned her over and she had a cut right here. That's how I found her.
Kathy! Kathy? Kathy? Kathy! 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 Kathy?
I panicked because I'm on federal paper and my record, and
it's understandable.
And the kids, I wrapped her up in some blankets and I put her in the truck. It took me a while because of my back and my leg. And the whole time I was just mad, like, what did you do? What did you do? And
He's telling this very emotional story about the only thing he could think to do was wrap her up and dump her out.
Where is she? For Luis. For Matthew.
We had talked to him about, the kids need closure, the family needs closure. Let's, bring Kathy back home.
An autopsy is performed.
The sternum was fractured and ribs fractured.
Unlikely injuries for what Juan claimed was an intentional overdose.
She still had muscle and some tissues on her leg, so that was used to test for toxicology, and there was nothing in her system that indicated that she committed suicide.
The autopsy bolsters the police theory of what happened that night.
I just can't keep talking to you. There's nothing left to say. We're done.
Kathy was done with him. Juan was going to be out on the streets. He had nowhere to go. His security line was cut.
Question, don't turn your back on me!
Nothing to say. Leave me alone.
I said don't turn!
Get off me!
And he put his hands around her neck to sit on top of her, squishing in. So as he's looking at the face of the mother of his children and looking at the face of the person he supposedly loves, he squeezes the life out of her.
"42 days after she went missing, Juan Gonzalez is charged with the murder of Kathy Lujan.
Juan seems to me like the kind of guy who feels that he can take what he wants from others, he could treat people how he wants, and become extremely upset, extremely indignant the moment he feels that somebody is trying to do that very same kind of stuff to him. And so here we have Kathy, in his eyes, betraying him, even though what she's doing is nowhere close to the sum total of what he's done to her over the years. And yet it looks to me like he felt justified in administering the death penalty.
By no means in any way do I think Kathy is responsible for her death, nor do I think she deserved it. However, if you look back at the course of the relationship between Juan and Kathy, what you see is that she accepts him and enables him and allows him to act in any way he wants. And the minute she puts her foot down, the minute she decides she deserves self-respect, he snaps. And I believe it's because Juan couldn't handle being told no. Juan couldn't handle having the responsibility placed in his lap that he had done something wrong, and so he had to go and kill Kathy, the person who made him accountable for what he had done all along.
Juan Gonzalez pleads guilty and is sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Kathy Lujan.
I feel that's so unfair because he gets to wake up every day. He gets to eat a meal every day. He gets to breathe every day.
He's an evil person. He knew that she loved them boys and he took her. All because she was becoming stronger.
The rain had not stopped for 3 days when they found her. In a quiet London street, where nothing ever happened and neighbors measured their lives by routine, a single blue police tape cut across the gray morning like a wound that refused to close. A young woman, 26, vanished without a trace. No scream, no struggle, just absence. And in the days that followed, one phrase echoed through newspapers, whispered across pubs, repeated on every television screen: mysterious disappearance. Her name was Emily Carter, a marketing assistant described by friends as careful, organized, predictable, the kind of person who texted when she got home, who never missed work, who locked her door twice before bed. On the night she disappeared, she had left her office near Canary Wharf just after 8:40 p.m. CCTV caught her walking toward the station, umbrella tilted against the rain, her figure swallowed by the crowd. That was the last confirmed sighting. By midnight, her phone went silent. By morning, her flat was untouched, her bag missing, her bed unslept in. Cold case beginnings are rarely dramatic. They begin with silence. The community reacted quickly, almost violently. Posters appeared overnight. Her photograph, smiling, hopeful, stared out from bus stops and storefront windows. Volunteers searched alleyways, parks, construction sites. Police flooded the area, retracing her steps, reviewing hours of footage frame by frame. And then the first strange clue surfaced. A witness came forward, a taxi driver who claimed he had seen a woman matching Emily's description arguing with a man near a side street just minutes after her last CCTV appearance. The man, he said, was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by shadow. No one could confirm it. No camera caught it. But it planted the first seed of something darker. Days turned into weeks. The investigation intensified. Detectives pulled phone records, financial transactions, emails. Nothing. Emily's life was clean, almost too clean. No debts, no enemies, no secret relationships. It was as if she had been erased, surgically, deliberately. The media began to shift its tone. What started as concern became suspicion. Headlines grew sharper. London mystery deepens. Missing woman feared dead. Police baffled. And still no body. Then came the second clue, and with it, a wave of hope that would later turn into something far more unsettling. A handbag was discovered in a canal, miles from where Emily was last seen. It was hers. Inside, her wallet, her ID, her keys. Everything except her phone. The bag showed no signs of damage, no evidence of a struggle. It had simply been placed there, as if someone wanted it to be found. The police called it a breakthrough. The public called it chilling. Divers searched the canal for days. Nothing. No trace of Emily. No forensic evidence that could tie the bag to any suspect. It was a dead end, but it changed the tone of the case. This was no longer a disappearance. This was something else. Something planned. As the months passed, the investigation widened. Detectives began to look beyond Emily's immediate circle. They interviewed coworkers, neighbors, former classmates. One name surfaced repeatedly, quietly at first, then with growing weight. Daniel Reeves, a former colleague who had left the company months before Emily vanished. He was described as quiet, withdrawn, occasionally intense. Some said he had shown interest in Emily, interest she did not return. Others dismissed it as harmless. Police brought him in for questioning. Daniel denied everything. He claimed he had not seen Emily in weeks. His alibi placed him at home the night she disappeared, alone. There was no evidence to contradict him. No CCTV, no witnesses, nothing that could tie him to the crime. He was released. The case moved on, but his name lingered, buried in reports, noted in margins, a detail that would not make headlines but refused to disappear. Years passed. The posters faded. The media moved on. New stories replaced old ones. Emily Carter became a name mentioned only occasionally, usually followed by two words that carry a particular kind of weight: cold case. For her family, the absence never dulled. Her parents kept her room unchanged. Her phone number remained active, messages sent into silence on birthdays, on holidays, on days that mattered. Hope is stubborn, even when logic says otherwise. In 2007, for years after her disappearance, the case was officially downgraded. Resources were reassigned. Files were archived. Detectives who had spent countless hours chasing leads were moved to new cases. The investigation did not end, but it slowed, drifting into the background of a city that does not wait for answers. London continued to move, indifferent, relentless. But cold cases have a way of waiting, of holding on to something small, something overlooked, something that does not make sense until years later. In Emily's case, that something was a piece of footage, barely noticed at the time. A grainy image from a camera positioned at the far end of the street where the taxi driver claimed to have seen the argument. At the time, it was dismissed. Too unclear, too distant, too insignificant. Just another figure in a dark coat, moving quickly out of frame. The footage was archived, like everything else. In 2010, a new detective was assigned to review unsolved cases, part of a broader initiative to re-examine cold cases with fresh eyes and new technology. Detective Inspector Laura Bennett had built a reputation for seeing patterns others missed. She approached Emily's case not as a tragedy, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. She read every report, every statement, every note. And when she reached the section on Daniel Reeves, she paused. There was nothing concrete. No evidence, no direct link. Just impressions, suspicions, a feeling shared by multiple witnesses that something about him was off. It wasn't enough for an arrest. It wasn't even enough for continued surveillance. But it was enough for Bennett to take a closer look. She requested the archived footage. Technology had advanced in the years since 2003. What was once too grainy to analyze could now be enhanced, stabilized, examined frame by frame. Bennett and her team spent hours working on the clip, isolating the figure, adjusting contrast, sharpening edges. Slowly, details began to emerge. A pattern on the coat, a distinctive gait, and then something else. A reflection in a nearby window, brief, almost invisible, but clear enough when enhanced. A face, partially obscured, but recognizable. It matched Daniel Reeves. The room went silent when the comparison was made. It wasn't definitive, not yet, but it was enough to reopen the case with urgency. For the first time in years, Emily Carter's name returned to the headlines. Cold case reopened, new evidence emerges, suspect identified. The city took notice again. Daniel was brought in for questioning once more. This time, the tone was different. The questions were sharper, more direct. He maintained his innocence, but cracks began to show. His timeline shifted slightly under pressure. Small inconsistencies appeared. Nothing that proved guilt, but enough to raise doubt. Meanwhile, forensic teams revisited the canal, this time with more advanced equipment. They expanded the search area, scanning deeper, wider. Weeks passed with no results. And then a discovery. Not a body, not yet, but something that had been missed before. A mobile phone, heavily corroded, buried in sediment. It was Emily's. The device was nearly destroyed, but specialists managed to recover fragments of data. Among them, a single, incomplete message, unsent, time-stamped minutes after her last confirmed sighting. It read, "He's here." No name, no context, just 3 words that sent a chill through everyone involved. The pressure mounted. Public interest surged. The media circled, hungry for answers. Bennett knew they were close, but close is not enough in a case like this. They needed something definitive, something that could not be explained away. And then, the forgotten clue revealed its final secret. The investigation tightened like a noose, quiet at first, then unmistakable. Every movement Daniel Reeves made was now watched, recorded, analyzed. His past, once dismissed as uneventful, began to fracture under scrutiny. Old coworkers remembered more than they had before, details that had seemed irrelevant now rearranging themselves into something darker. He had been seen lingering near Emily's desk weeks before she vanished, not speaking, just watching. He had asked casual questions about her routine, when she left work, whether she lived alone. At the time, it was awkward. Now, it was something else entirely. Detective Bennett returned to the footage again, obsessively, as if the pixels themselves might confess. The enhanced image of the man in the dark coat was no longer just a silhouette. The angle of the shoulders, the length of stride, the slight inward turn of the left foot, it all aligned with Daniel. A forensic gait analyst confirmed it was highly consistent with his movement pattern. Still not absolute proof, but the case was no longer drifting. It was moving, gaining weight, momentum. Search warrants followed. Daniel's flat, once described as sparse and orderly, revealed more than expected. Nothing overtly incriminating at first glance, but details that unsettled the investigators. A collection of newspapers, carefully preserved, each one featuring Emily's disappearance on the front page. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens spanning weeks. Clippings arranged chronologically, almost like a timeline curated by someone who had been there from the beginning. There were notes in the margins, small observations, times, locations, details that had never been publicly released. That was the first real crack. Bennett stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by silent evidence, and felt the shift. This was no longer about suspicion. This was proximity. This was knowledge that should not exist outside the investigation. And yet Daniel had it. He was brought in again, this time not as a person of interest, but as a primary suspect. The interrogation room was colder than usual, the air thick with something unspoken. Daniel sat still, hands folded, eyes steady, but there was a tension beneath the surface, a barely contained current. Bennett laid out the evidence slowly, methodically. The footage, the gait analysis, the newspaper clippings, the recovered phone message. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. He denied involvement, of course. Repeated the same lines, the same alibi, but now it sounded rehearsed, hollow. When pressed about the clippings, he claimed he had followed the case like everyone else. When confronted with the unpublished details, he hesitated, just for a second, then deflected. It wasn't enough to charge him. Not yet. But the walls were closing in. Outside the interrogation room, the case was reaching a fever pitch. Media coverage exploded. Headlines screamed of a breakthrough, of a suspect finally identified. The public, once resigned to the mystery, was suddenly pulled back into it, drawn by the possibility of answers after years of silence. The phrase cold case no longer felt final. It felt temporary, like a pause before something inevitable. Forensic teams returned to Daniel's past, digging deeper, further back than before. His digital footprint, though limited, revealed patterns. Searches related to canals, to decomposition, to police procedures. Dates that aligned uncomfortably with a timeline of Emily's disappearance. Again, not definitive but consistent, forming a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. A retired officer, reviewing old notes after seeing the renewed media coverage, noticed something that had been overlooked for years. A witness statement, taken in the early days of the investigation, from a woman who lived near the canal where Emily's bag had been found. She had reported seeing a man late at night, standing by the water, throwing something in. At the time, it had been dismissed as unrelated. The description was vague, the timing uncertain. It had been filed away, forgotten. Until now. The officer contacted Bennett, who immediately reopened the lead. The witness was older now, her memory faded, but when shown a photograph of Daniel Reeves, she paused. Long enough to matter. She couldn't say for certain, but she said he looked familiar. The same height, the same build, the same stillness. It wasn't proof, but it was another piece. Bennett knew they needed more. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, would not be enough to secure a conviction. They needed something physical, something undeniable. And that meant going back to the beginning, to the place where Emily had last been seen, to the street where the rain had fallen for 3 days without stopping. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, scanning areas that had never been examined in detail. Construction sites, abandoned lots, patches of land that had changed hands over the years. London had evolved since 2003, buildings rising where empty spaces once stood. But beneath it, the past remained. Days turned into weeks, and just as the momentum threatened to stall, the signal came. A disturbance in the soil, deep beneath what was now a small parking area, just a few blocks from Emily's last known location. Excavation began immediately. The city held its breath. What they found was not immediate, not obvious. Layers of soil, debris, time itself had to be peeled back. And then, slowly, the outline emerged. Human remains. Fragmented, incomplete, but unmistakable. Alongside them, traces of fabric, a piece of jewelry, items that could survive where everything else had decayed. Dental records confirmed it. Emily Carter had been there all along. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. What had once been a disappearance was now a confirmed murder. The timeline shifted, the narrative hardened, and Daniel Reeves, already under intense scrutiny, found himself at the center of something far more serious. Forensic analysis of the site revealed more. Fibers that matched clothing found in Daniel's flat. Soil traces that aligned with residues on a pair of boots he had kept for years. Small details, individually insignificant, now converging into something undeniable. The case was no longer built on suspicion. It was built on connection. Daniel was arrested. The news broke instantly. London 2003 cold case solved, suspect in custody. The words spread across screens, across headlines, across conversations. For the first time in years, there was a sense of closure, or at least the possibility of it. But the story did not end there. During interrogation, faced with the mounting evidence, Daniel's composure began to crack. Not in a dramatic outburst, not in a sudden confession, but in subtle shifts. A change in tone, a hesitation before answering, a flicker of something in his eyes when certain details were mentioned. Bennett pressed harder, pushing him, cornering him with the evidence they had spent years assembling. And then finally he spoke. Not a full confession, not yet, but enough. He admitted to being there that night, claimed it had been an accident, a confrontation that escalated beyond his control. He described following Emily, confronting her, a conversation that turned into an argument. He said she had threatened to report him for harassment, that he had panicked. The details were fragmented, incomplete, but they aligned with the evidence in ways that could no longer be dismissed. He led them through parts of the sequence, stopping short of the final act, as if unable or unwilling to cross that line. But it was enough. Enough to charge him. Enough to bring the case to court. As the legal process began, the community that had once been gripped by fear now found itself confronting something else, the reality of what had been hidden in plain sight for years. A man who had lived among them, unnoticed, unremarkable, now revealed as the center of a crime that had haunted them for over a decade. For Emily's family, the discovery was both a relief and a reopening of wounds. They finally had answers, but those answers came with a weight that could not be lifted. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by something permanent, something that could not be undone. And at the center of it all, one detail lingered, refusing to fade. The message recovered from Emily's phone, those 3 words sent into the dark just moments before everything changed. He's here. A warning, a recognition, a moment of realization that came too late. The forgotten clue that had been buried for years had not just solved a case. It had revealed the truth that had been waiting, silent, patient, beneath the surface. The courtroom filled long before the trial began, a quiet tension settling into every seat, every breath measured, every glance heavy with expectation. More than a decade had passed since Emily Carter vanished into a London night that refused to explain itself, and now, at last, there was a man sitting behind reinforced glass, his expression unreadable, his presence enough to draw the city back into a story it had never truly let go. The phrase cold case no longer echoed as a question but as something transformed, something resolved, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, the unease remained, because answers, when they finally come, rarely feel complete. Daniel Reeves looked smaller in person than he had in photographs, diminished not just by the weight of the charges against him but by the years that had passed since that night in 2003. His hair had thinned, his posture slightly curved inward, as if time itself had been pressing him down. Yet there was still something intact, something controlled in the way he sat, hands folded, eyes forward, never lingering too long on any one face. Not on the jury, not on the judge, and certainly not on Emily's family, who sat just rows away, their presence both quiet and unyielding. The prosecution moved with precision, building the case not as a sudden revelation but as a slow, tightening sequence of facts that left little room for escape. They began where all stories of this kind begin, with the ordinary. Emily leaving work, the CCTV footage capturing her final known movements, the routine that had once defined her life now reduced to timestamps and grainy images. The jury watched as the footage played, frame by frame, the moments stretching longer than it ever had in reality, each second carrying more weight than the last. Then came the shift. The enhanced footage, the figure in the dark coat, once dismissed, now brought into sharp focus. Experts explained the process, the technology that had turned an indistinct silhouette into something identifiable. They spoke of gait analysis, of patterns in movement that are as unique as fingerprints when studied closely enough. The jury leaned forward, drawn into the detail, the science, the certainty that seemed to grow with each explanation. And then the comparison. Daniel Reeves's walk, recorded under controlled conditions, placed side by side with the figure from that night. The similarities were undeniable, not absolute, but compelling in a way that settled into the room and stayed there. The defense pushed back, as expected, questioning the reliability of enhanced footage, the subjectivity of gait analysis, the danger of seeing what one expects to see. They spoke of coincidence, of the thousands of people who walked those streets every night, of the impossibility of reducing identity to movement alone. Their arguments were sharp, deliberate, but they lacked something the prosecution had begun to build, a narrative that connected each piece into something larger, something harder to dismantle. When the recovered phone was introduced, the atmosphere shifted again. The device itself, damaged, almost unrecognizable, was presented not as an object, but as a voice from the past, a fragment of a moment that had been frozen in time. The forensic specialist explained the recovery process, the painstaking work required to extract even the smallest piece of data from something so degraded. And then the message, 3 words, displayed on a screen that seemed too large for something so simple. He's here. There was a silence that followed, not the kind that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from recognition. The jury did not need it to be explained. They understood what it meant, or at least what it suggested. A moment of awareness, a sudden shift from normality to danger, captured in a message that was never sent. The prosecution let it linger, allowed the weight of it to settle before moving on. They returned to Daniel, to his connection to Emily, to the small details that had once seemed insignificant. The questions he had asked, the times he had been seen near her, the interests that had been described as awkward, harmless. They reframed it, not as coincidence but as pattern, as escalation. They introduced the newspapers found in his flat, the clippings, the notes, the details that had never been made public. Each one a thread, and together, a web that placed him not on the periphery of the case, but at its center. The defense countered with alternative interpretations, with the argument that following a high-profile case does not make someone a criminal, that curiosity, even obsession, is not evidence of guilt. They suggested contamination, the possibility that Daniel had learned details through unofficial channels, through rumor, through the kind of information that circulates in ways that cannot always be traced. They reminded the jury that suspicion, no matter how strong, is not proof. But then the prosecution introduced the site. The images from the excavation were stark, stripped of any attempt at dramatization. Soil, layers, the careful process of uncovering what had been hidden for years. The remains identified through dental records, the fragments of clothing, the small items that tied the site to Emily. The location itself, so close to where she had last been seen, so ordinary on the surface, now revealed as something else entirely. A place that had held a secret in silence while the city moved above it, unaware. Forensic experts detailed the findings, the fibers that matched items found in Daniel's possession, the soil traces that connected his belongings to the burial site. Each point was presented with clinical clarity, the kind that leaves little room for interpretation. The defense attempted to challenge the chain of custody, the possibility of secondary transfer, the ways in which evidence can mislead when viewed without context. But the accumulation was difficult to ignore. One piece might be explained away, perhaps two, but together, they formed something heavier, something that resisted simple dismissal. When Daniel took the stand, the room seemed to contract around him. It was a calculated risk, one that could either humanize him or expose him further. He spoke quietly, his voice controlled, recounting his version of events with a carefulness that suggested rehearsal. He admitted to being near Emily that night, to speaking with her, to an argument that had escalated. He described panic, fear, a moment that spiraled beyond his control. But he stopped short of admitting to deliberate harm, framing what happened as an accident, a tragedy born of poor judgment rather than intent. The prosecution pressed him, their questions precise, unrelenting. They asked about the message, about the clippings, about the details he could not easily explain. They returned again and again to the timeline, to the gaps, to the inconsistencies that had begun to appear under scrutiny. Daniel's composure wavered, not dramatically, but enough. A hesitation here, a shift in tone there, small fractures that, when seen together, suggested something beneath the surface. Outside the courtroom, the city watched, the story unfolding in real time across screens and headlines. London 2003 cold case solved had become more than a headline. It was a narrative that people had invested in, a mystery that had shaped itself into something almost mythic over the years. Now, as the details emerged, as the reality replaced speculation, the reaction was complex. Relief, certainly, that there was an answer, that the unknown had been confronted. But also a deeper unease, the realization that the person responsible had not been a stranger passing through, but someone who had lived among them, unnoticed, ordinary. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the focus shifted to impact, to the consequences that extended beyond the courtroom. Emily's family was given the opportunity to speak, their words measured but heavy with the years they had carried this absence. They spoke of loss, of the way time does not heal but changes the shape of pain, of the birthdays and holidays marked by an empty space that could not be filled. They spoke of the moment they learned the truth, of the relief and the devastation that arrived together, inseparable. Daniel listened, his expression unchanged, or perhaps too carefully controlled to reveal anything genuine. It was impossible to tell what, if anything, moved behind that stillness. The jury watched him, as they had throughout, searching for something that might confirm or contradict the narrative they had been given. In the end, the case that had once been defined by absence was now defined by presence, by evidence, by a sequence of events that had been reconstructed piece by piece until it formed something coherent, something that could be judged. The verdict, when it came, would not erase what had happened, would not return what had been lost, but it would mark an end to the question that had lingered for so long. And yet, even as that end approached, there was a sense that something would remain unresolved, not in the facts, but in the feeling that cases like this leave behind. The knowledge that a life can be interrupted so completely that a person can vanish into a night and leave behind only fragments, clues that take years to understand. The realization that the line between ordinary and extraordinary can be crossed in a moment, unnoticed until it is too late. The rain returned to London as the trial neared its final day, a quiet echo of the night when it had all begun. Streets glistened under gray skies, reflections stretching and distorting in puddles that seemed to hold more than just water. Somewhere in that city, people moved through their routines, unaware of how close they might come to something they would never see, never understand. And in the courtroom, as the final arguments were prepared, as the jury readied itself to decide, the story of Emily Carter reached its final, inevitable point, not as a mystery anymore, but as something else, something heavier, something that would linger long after the verdict was spoken, carried in memory, in headlines, in the quiet spaces where questions once lived and answers now stood, incomplete but undeniable. The verdict did not come quickly, and in that delay the tensions stretched across the city like a wire pulled too tight, every hour feeding speculation, every silence amplifying the weight of what was about to be decided. Inside the jury room, 12 individuals carried the responsibility of untangling more than a decade of absence, of turning fragments into certainty, of deciding whether the man they had watched for weeks was the answer to a question that had haunted London since 2003. Outside, cameras remained fixed on the courthouse steps, reporters repeating the same phrases with different urgency, the words cold case and shocking arrest now part of a narrative that demanded closure. When the jury finally returned, the room shifted in a way that could be felt before a single word was spoken. It was in the way people sat straighter, in the way breath seemed to pause collectively, in the way even the smallest movement carried significance. Daniel Reeves stood, slower than expected, his expression unchanged but his eyes sharper now, as if bracing for impact. Emily Carter's family did not look at him. They kept their focus forward, on the moment, on the outcome they had waited years to hear.
Guilty.
The word landed with a force that was both immediate and delayed, understood instantly, yet reverberating long after it was spoken. Guilty of murder. Guilty of concealment. Guilty of turning a life into a question that had taken years to answer. There was no outburst, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet release that moved through the room in waves, subtle but undeniable. For some, it was relief. For others, it was something closer to exhaustion, the end of a long, invisible strain that had stretched across years. Daniel's reaction was almost imperceptible. A tightening of the jaw, a slight shift in posture, the kind of controlled response that reveals more in what it hides than what it shows. He did not protest, did not react outwardly, but the stillness around him felt different now, no longer neutral, no longer protected by uncertainty. The verdict had changed the space he occupied, redefining him not as a suspect, not as a possibility, but as the answer. Sentencing followed with the same deliberate pace that had defined the trial. The judge spoke at length, outlining the gravity of the crime, the years of silence, the deliberate actions that had concealed the truth. Words like calculated, sustained, and irreversible echoed through the courtroom, each one reinforcing the finality of what had been decided. A life sentence was imposed, with no immediate possibility of release, a punishment that extended into a future Daniel would now spend behind walls, removed from the city that had unknowingly carried his secret for so long. Outside, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines updated in real time, shifting from speculation to conclusion. London 2003 cold case solved, killer convicted. The narrative that had begun with disappearance had reached its endpoint, at least in the eyes of the law. People gathered in small groups, discussing the case, revisiting details, sharing theories that had once been guesses, but now felt like pieces of a story they could finally understand. The city, which had moved on years ago, found itself looking back, re-examining a moment that had never fully faded. For Emily's family, the verdict was not an ending in the traditional sense. It did not restore what had been lost, did not erase the years of uncertainty, did not fill the space that her absence had created. But it did something else, something quieter and perhaps more significant. It replaced the unknown with certainty. It transformed a question into an answer, even if that answer carried its own weight, its own kind of pain. They left the courthouse together, not speaking to the press, not offering statements, their silence more powerful than any words they could have chosen. In the days that followed, the story continued to unfold, not in the courtroom, but in the details that emerged once the pressure of the trial had passed. Investigators released additional information, filling in gaps that had been left unexplored during proceedings. The sequence of events on the night Emily disappeared became clearer, more defined. Daniel had followed her from the station, maintaining a distance, waiting for a moment when the street would empty, when the routine flow of people would break just enough to create an opening. The confrontation had not been spontaneous, not entirely. It had been building, shaped by weeks of observation, by an obsession that had grown quietly unnoticed. When he approached her, it was not with immediate violence, but with words, with an attempt to force a connection that had never existed. Emily's response, firm and direct, had escalated the situation. She had recognized something in him, something that did not belong in that moment, and her reaction had been immediate, instinctive. The message on her phone, those 3 words, had been sent in that instant of recognition, a warning that would never reach its destination. What followed was brief, chaotic, and irreversible. The details, though known to investigators, were never fully released, not out of secrecy, but out of a recognition that some things do not need to be repeated to be understood. What mattered was the outcome. The fact that in a matter of moments, a life had been taken, a decision made that could never be undone. Daniel's actions after the fact revealed a different kind of clarity, a methodical approach that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the act itself. He had moved quickly, efficiently, choosing a location he knew, a place that offered concealment not through isolation, but through normality. A patch of ground that would not draw attention, that would blend into the city's constant state of change. He had returned to his routine the next day, to work, to conversations, to a life that continued as if nothing had happened. It was this duality, this ability to compartmentalize, that unsettled investigators the most. The bag in the canal, once a puzzling clue, was now understood as part of that same pattern. A calculated decision to redirect attention, to create a narrative that would lead investigators away from the truth. It had worked for a time, long enough for the case to cool, for the urgency to fade, for the possibility of resolution to diminish. Until it didn't. The role of the forgotten clue, the piece of footage that had been dismissed, became a focal point in discussions that followed the case. Experts analyzed it, debated it, used it as an example of how small details can hold significance beyond their initial appearance. The advancements in technology that had allowed it to be re-examined were highlighted, not as a solution in themselves, but as a tool that, when combined with persistence, could turn possibility into proof. Detective Bennett, whose decision to revisit the case had set the final sequence in motion, remained largely out of the public eye. Her work was acknowledged, her role recognized, but she did not seek attention. For her, the case was not about headlines or recognition, but about resolution, about ensuring that something left unfinished was brought to its conclusion. In private, she would later describe the moment the footage revealed its hidden detail, not as a breakthrough, but as a confirmation of something she had felt from the beginning, that the answer had always been there, waiting to be seen. As weeks turned into months, the intensity of the story began to fade, replaced by new events, new headlines, new narratives that demanded attention. But the impact of the case lingered, not just in memory, but in subtle changes that rippled through the community. People became more aware, more cautious, more attuned to the spaces they moved through and the individuals who shared them. The idea that something so significant could remain hidden for so long altered perceptions, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, there was a sense of completion, but also a recognition that some questions would never be fully answered. Why Emily? Why that moment? What internal shift had turned Daniel from an observer into a participant, from someone on the edge of her life into the center of its end? These were questions that extended beyond evidence, beyond what could be proven or disproven. They existed in a space that the legal system does not occupy, a space of motive, of psychology, of human complexity that resists simple explanation. In the end, the story of Emily Carter became more than a case. It became a reminder of how easily normality can be disrupted, how quickly a routine can fracture into something unrecognizable. It became a narrative of patience, of persistence, of the way time can obscure and then reveal, depending on how closely one is willing to look. And above all, it became a testament to the idea that even the smallest detail, the most easily dismissed clue, can hold the key to something far larger, something that waits quietly until the moment it is finally understood. The rain returned again, as it often does in London, washing over streets that had long since absorbed the memory of what had happened. People moved through their days, past the places that had once been marked by tape and questions, now indistinguishable from any other part of the city. But beneath that surface, the story remained, carried in memory, in records, in the quiet knowledge that for years, the answer had been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. Years passed again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. The case was no longer open, no longer suspended in uncertainty, yet it refused to settle into something distant or forgotten. The name Emily Carter did not fade the way other names did. It lingered, resurfacing in documentaries, in late-night discussions, in quiet conversations where people spoke not just about what had happened, but about how long it had taken to uncover the truth. The phrase "cold case solved" became a headline, but behind it remained a deeper unease, a recognition that resolution does not erase the years that came before it. The street where she was last seen returned to normal, at least on the surface. People walked the same pavement, waited at the same crossings, checked their phones under the same streetlights that had once cast long shadows over a moment no one had witnessed clearly. There was no plaque, no visible marker to indicate that anything had happened there, and yet for those who knew the story, the space felt different. Not haunted in a dramatic sense, but altered, as if the ordinary had been quietly redefined. The parking area where her remains had been discovered was resurfaced within months, the ground leveled, the disruption erased. Cars came and went, drivers unaware of what had once been beneath their tires. The city moved forward, efficient and indifferent, as it always does. But the knowledge remained, held by those who had followed the case, by those who had been part of it, by those who understood that beneath the layers of asphalt and routine, there had once been a secret that waited years to be uncovered. Daniel Reeves disappeared from public view after sentencing, his name mentioned only in relation to the case, his identity reduced to the role he had played in a narrative that no longer needed him to continue. Inside the prison system, he became another number, another file, another individual absorbed into a structure designed to contain rather than explain. Reports indicated that he kept to himself, that he spoke little, that he maintained the same controlled demeanor he had shown throughout the trial. There were no further statements, no attempts to revisit the case, no public reflections. Whatever explanations existed remained locked within him, inaccessible, incomplete. For investigators, the case became a reference point, a reminder of both failure and persistence. Training sessions began to include it as an example, not just of how a case can go cold, but of how it can be brought back. The overlooked footage, the dismissed witness statement, the fragments that had seemed insignificant until they were not, these became lessons, warnings against the assumption that a lack of evidence is the same as a lack of truth. Detective Bennett, when asked about it in professional settings, spoke not of intuition or luck, but of attention, of the importance of returning to what has been set aside, of questioning conclusions that feel too final. Emily's family adjusted to a reality that was both clearer and more complex than the one they had lived with before. The uncertainty that had once defined their days was gone, replaced by a knowledge that carried its own kind of permanence. They no longer wondered where she was, but they lived with the certainty of how her life had ended, of the moments that had led to it, of the fact that it had all happened within a space that had seemed so ordinary. They spoke occasionally in controlled settings about the importance of continuing investigations, about the need to revisit cases that have been set aside, about the idea that time should not determine whether something is worth solving. Anniversaries became quieter, less public, but no less significant. Each year, on the date she disappeared, a small group would gather, not in the street itself, but nearby, in a place that allowed for reflection without intrusion. There were no large gestures, no media presence, just a shared acknowledgement of a life that had been interrupted and a case that had taken years to resolve. The tone was not one of mourning alone, but of remembrance, of holding on to something that could not be measured by headlines or outcomes. The message recovered from her phone remained one of the most discussed elements of the case, not because of its content, but because of what it represented. 3 words, simple and incomplete, had carried enough weight to reopen an investigation, to redirect attention, to contribute to a sequence of events that would eventually lead to a conviction. Analysts, journalists, and investigators returned to it repeatedly, examining its timing, its context, its implications. It became a symbol, not just of the moment itself, but of the idea that even the smallest fragment can hold significance beyond its size. There were debates, too, about the nature of closure, about whether a case like this could ever truly be considered finished. Some argued that the conviction marked a clear endpoint, that justice had been served, that the system had functioned as it should, even if delayed. Others suggested that the years of uncertainty, the time lost, the questions that remained unanswered, prevented any sense of true resolution. The discussion extended beyond this case, touching on broader issues of investigation, of resources, of the ways in which certain cases are prioritized while others fade. In quieter moments, away from public discourse, the story settled into something more personal, more reflective. People who had lived in the area at the time recalled small details they had once dismissed, a figure on the street, a moment of hesitation, a feeling that something was not quite right. Memory, unreliable as it is, reshaped itself in the light of what had been revealed, turning ordinary moments into something that felt significant in hindsight. It was not that they had seen something and ignored it, but that they had not known what they were seeing, had not understood the context that would only come years later. The idea that the answer had been present from the beginning, hidden within the noise of everyday life, remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. It suggested a proximity, a closeness that challenged assumptions about distance and safety. It implied that the boundary between normal and abnormal is not always clear, that it can exist in the same space, at the same time, without immediate recognition. As time continued to move, the case became part of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond its specific details. It was referenced alongside other long unsolved cases, used as an example of what can happen when persistence meets opportunity, when overlooked details are revisited, when technology advances just enough to reveal what was once obscured. But even within that broader context, it retained its individuality, its specific combination of elements that could not be fully replicated. The rain, constant and unremarkable, continued to fall over the city in cycles, washing over streets that held more history than they revealed. On certain nights, when the conditions mirrored those of the night in 2003, when the light hit the pavement in the same way, when the air carried the same quiet, there was a sense, however subtle, that the past was closer than it appeared. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that existed just beneath awareness, a reminder that time does not erase, it layers. And somewhere within that layering, within the accumulation of moments, of decisions, of overlooked details, and eventual discoveries, the story of Emily Carter remained. Not as a mystery anymore, not as an unanswered question, but as something that had moved through uncertainty into clarity, leaving behind a trace that could not be removed. A cold case that had once been defined by absence, by silence, by the space between what was known and what was not, had become something else entirely. A story that had been completed, but not concluded, because its impact extended beyond the moment of resolution, into the way it was remembered, discussed, and understood. In the end, what remained was not just the fact that the case had been solved, but the way in which it had unfolded, the time it had taken, the details that had been missed and then found, the persistence that had carried it forward. It remained in the quiet understanding that answers, when they come, are rarely simple, rarely complete, but necessary all the same. And in that understanding, the city moved on, as it always does, carrying with it a story that would not be forgotten, not because it demanded attention, but because it had earned its place in memory, in the space where the past and the present intersect, and where the truth, once revealed, continues to echo long after it has been spoken. Time did not close the case. It only changed the way it was carried. What had once been a question whispered in uncertainty became a story told with a strange clarity, but clarity did not soften it. If anything, it sharpened the edges. People no longer asked what happened to Emily Carter. They asked how it could have happened for so long without being seen, without being understood, without being stopped. The answer, unsettling in its simplicity, was that nothing about it had seemed extraordinary at the time. That was the part that stayed with people. Not the crime itself, but the silence that surrounded it. The city absorbed the story the way it absorbs everything else, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it became part of the background. Yet certain details refused to blend in. The image of a woman walking alone under a streetlight, the quiet glow of a phone screen in the rain, the idea of a message sent but never delivered. These fragments lingered, replayed in different minds, in different ways, forming a kind of collective memory that did not belong to any one person but was shared across those who had followed the case. In the years after the conviction, interest did not disappear. It evolved. Documentaries revisited the timeline, reconstructing the sequence with precision, overlaying narration with images that had once been evidence and were now artifacts. Analysts broke down the investigation, step by step, pointing to the moments where it could have turned differently, where a detail might have been noticed sooner, where a connection might have been made. The footage that had once been dismissed became central to these discussions, not just as a breakthrough, but as a symbol of how easily something can be overlooked when it does not immediately fit the narrative. There was a fascination, too, with Daniel Reeves, not in the sense of admiration, but in the attempt to understand how someone could exist in such proximity to others while carrying something so hidden. Psychologists offered explanations, theories about fixation, about control, about the gradual shift from observation to action. None of them fully satisfied the question. They provided frameworks, language, ways of describing behavior, but they did not bridge the gap between knowing and understanding. That gap remained, and perhaps it always would. Inside the prison where he now lived, Daniel's world had contracted to a routine that mirrored the one he had maintained before, but stripped of choice, of variation, of the illusion of normality. Reports from within described him as compliant, quiet, unremarkable in a place where such traits are often the only way to exist without drawing attention. He did not speak about the case, did not offer new information, did not attempt to reshape the narrative that had been built around him. If there were thoughts, reflections, regrets, they remained internal, inaccessible, part of a silence that was now enforced rather than chosen. For Detective Bennett, the case did not end with the verdict. It stayed with her, not as a burden, but as a reference point, a reminder of what persistence can reveal and what it can miss. She returned to other cases with a different perspective, carrying with her the knowledge that time can both obscure and clarify, that details dismissed once can become central later. In quiet moments, she would revisit the footage, not because it was necessary, but because it represented something fundamental about the nature of investigation, the idea that truth does not always present itself clearly, that it often requires patience, repetition, and a willingness to question what has already been decided. The witness who had come forward years later, the woman who had seen a figure by the canal and thought little of it at the time, became part of the narrative as well. Her role, though small in isolation, took on significance when placed within the larger sequence. She spoke briefly to reporters, describing how memory had shifted over time, how something that had seemed ordinary had gained weight once the context was known. Her experience reflected a broader truth about the case, that understanding is often retrospective, that meaning is assigned after the fact, when pieces begin to align. The canal itself remained unchanged, its surface reflecting the same muted colors, its presence as unremarkable as it had always been. People passed by without noticing, without thinking of what had once been found there, of the bag that had introduced a new layer of complexity to a case that was already difficult to define. It existed as it always had, part of the city's landscape, holding its history quietly, without acknowledgement. There were moments when the story resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by something unrelated. Another missing person case, another headline that echoed familiar phrases, another investigation that seemed to stall. In those moments, Emily's case would be referenced, not as a direct comparison, but as a reminder that resolution is possible, that time does not necessarily erase the chance for answers. It became a point of cautious optimism, balanced by the understanding that not every case follows the same path. For those who had been closest to her, the passage of time did not diminish the significance of what had happened, but it changed the way it was felt. Grief, once sharp and immediate, settled into something steadier, less visible but no less present. The knowledge of what had happened provided a framework, a way to place the loss within a defined context, but it did not simplify it. It did not make it easier, only different. The message, still preserved as part of the case file, continued to draw attention. It was studied, referenced, discussed, not because it contained detailed information, but because of its simplicity, its immediacy. It represented a moment that could not be extended, a point at which awareness met danger, captured in a form that was both incomplete and definitive. It was, in many ways, the purest expression of the case, a fragment that contained within it the entire shift from normality to something else. As the years continued, the story settled into a quieter existence, no longer dominating headlines, no longer the focus of daily conversation, but still present in the collective awareness. It became one of those cases that people remember not for a single detail, but for the way it unfolded, for the time it took, for the realization that came with it. It was referenced in passing, in discussions about safety, about awareness, about the unpredictability of human behavior. The city, as always, continued to move. New buildings replaced old ones, new faces filled familiar spaces, new stories emerged and took precedence. But beneath that constant motion, there was a layer that remained unchanged, a collection of moments that had shaped the way people understood their environment, their routines, their assumptions. Emily's story was part of that layer, integrated into the fabric of the city in a way that did not require acknowledgement to exist. On certain evenings, when the light faded in the same way it had years before, when the streets carried that same quiet tension between activity and stillness, there was a sense, subtle but persistent, that the past was not entirely separate from the present. Not in a way that suggested repetition, but in a way that reminded those who noticed that what has happened does not disappear, that it continues to exist in memory, in awareness, in the way people move through their lives. And in that ongoing movement, in the balance between what is known and what is felt, the case remained. Not as an open question, not as an unsolved mystery, but as something resolved in fact yet unresolved in impact. A story that had reached its conclusion in the legal sense, but continued to echo in ways that could not be measured or contained. A reminder that even when answers are found, even when the narrative is complete, the effects extend beyond the moment of resolution, into the spaces where memory and meaning intersect, and where the past continues to shape the present in ways that are both visible and unseen. Long after the headlines faded and the courtroom emptied, the story did not end. It settled into something quieter, more unsettling, a presence that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. People stopped speaking about the case in urgent tones, yet it lingered in the back of conversations, in the pauses between unrelated topics, in the way certain phrases, cold case, missing woman, final message, could still shift the atmosphere in a room without warning. It was no longer breaking news, but it had become something more permanent, something embedded in the way the city remembered. There was a subtle change in how people moved through familiar spaces. It was not dramatic, not enough to alter the rhythm of daily life, but it was there. A longer glance over the shoulder, a quicker step under dim streetlights, a moment of hesitation before turning into a quiet street. These were not acts of fear, Not exactly, but of awareness, shaped by the understanding that what had happened to Emily Carter had not occurred in isolation, in some distant or unreachable place. It had happened here, within the same streets, the same routines, the same ordinary flow of life. The narrative of the case began to shift once more, moving away from the specifics of the crime and toward the broader implications it carried. Analysts spoke about patterns of behavior that often go unnoticed, about the ways in which individuals can exist on the edges of attention without ever crossing fully into view. They discussed the nature of obsession, the gradual progression from observation to intrusion, from curiosity to control. But even as these discussions unfolded, there remained a sense that something essential was missing, that no explanation could fully account for the moment when thought becomes action, when a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. For those who revisited the footage, the grainy image that had once been overlooked now carried an almost symbolic weight. It was studied not just as evidence, but as a representation of how close the truth had been, how visible and yet invisible at the same time. The figure in the dark coat, moving quickly through the frame, no longer seemed like a background detail. It was central, undeniable, a reminder that sometimes the most important element of a story is the one that is easiest to dismiss. In quiet academic circles, the case was dissected with precision. Investigative timelines were reconstructed, decisions analyzed, alternative scenarios considered. What if the footage had been enhanced sooner? What if the witness statement near the canal had been prioritized differently? What if the connection to Daniel Reeves had been explored more aggressively in the early days? These questions did not change the outcome, but they revealed the fragile nature of investigations, the way they depend not just on evidence, but on interpretation, on timing, on the human ability to recognize significance in the midst of uncertainty. And yet, despite all the analysis, all the hindsight, there remained a core element that resisted complete understanding. It was not the how, which had been reconstructed in detail, nor the who, which had been established beyond doubt. It was the why, the internal shift that had transformed a quiet observer into someone capable of irreversible action. That question lingered, unanswered, not because it lacked importance, but because it existed in a space that could not be fully accessed or explained. Emily's story began to take on a different role over time, not just as a case that had been solved, but as a reference point, a narrative that shaped how other cases were approached, how certain details were treated, how assumptions were challenged. Investigators spoke of it in training sessions, emphasizing the importance of revisiting evidence, of questioning initial conclusions, of recognizing that the absence of clarity does not mean the absence of truth. It became part of a collective knowledge, a lesson carried forward into future investigations. But beyond the professional sphere, beyond the structured analysis and procedural lessons, the story lived in a more personal way. It existed in the memories of those who had followed it from the beginning, who had watched it unfold in real time, who had experienced the long stretch of uncertainty and the sudden shift into clarity. For them, the case was not just a sequence of events, but an experience, something that had shaped their perception of reality, of safety, of the unseen dynamics that exist within everyday life. There were moments, small and unplanned, when the past seemed to surface unexpectedly. A passing mention in a conversation, a documentary playing in the background, a headline about another case that echoed familiar themes. In those moments, the details would return, not in full, but in fragments. The rain, the empty street, the message that never reached its destination. These fragments did not demand attention, but they carried enough weight to be felt, enough to remind those who recognized them that the story was not entirely confined to the past. For Emily's family, the passage of time brought a different kind of continuity. Their lives moved forward, as all lives do, shaped by new experiences, new moments, but always carrying the imprint of what had happened. The knowledge of the truth provided a foundation, something solid where once there had been uncertainty, but it did not remove the absence. It did not fill the space that had been left behind. It simply defined it, gave it a form that could be acknowledged, even if it could never be fully accepted. The idea of closure, often spoken about in cases like this, began to feel less like a destination and more like a concept, something that suggests an ending but rarely delivers one in a complete sense. There was resolution, certainly, a conclusion in the legal and factual sense, but closure implied something more final, something that did not align with the reality of how such events are experienced. The story had an ending, but its impact did not. The city, vast and constantly evolving, absorbed the case into its history without ceremony. There were no permanent markers, no official acknowledgments, just the quiet integration of one more story into a landscape filled with them. Yet for those who knew, who remembered, the absence of visible signs did not diminish its presence. It existed in knowledge, in memory, in the subtle ways it had influenced perception. And so the story remained, not as something that demanded to be retold, but as something that could not be entirely forgotten. A cold case that had once been defined by silence had found its voice, had revealed its truth, but in doing so, it had also exposed the complexity that lies beneath resolution. It had shown that answers, while necessary, are not always sufficient, that they close certain questions while leaving others open, existing in a space that is both complete and incomplete at the same time. In the end, what lingered was not just the sequence of events, not just the investigation or the trial or the verdict, but the understanding that emerged from it. The recognition that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that the visible does not always reveal the truth, that time can both hide and uncover in equal measure. These were not lessons that could be easily summarized or neatly concluded. They were impressions carried forward, shaping the way people saw the world around them, even if they were not always aware of it. The rain fell again, as it always does, tracing the same paths along the streets, reflecting the same lights, creating the same quiet atmosphere that had once framed the beginning of a story that took years to fully understand. And in that familiar setting, in that repetition of elements, there was a sense of continuity, of cycles that continue regardless of what has happened within them. But for those who remembered, who carried the story with them in some form, the rain was more than just weather. It was a reminder, subtle and persistent, of a moment when everything changed, of a truth that had been hidden and then revealed, and of a story that, even in its conclusion, continued to echo long after the final word had been spoken. There is a moment in every case like this when the story stops belonging to the people directly involved and becomes something else, something that moves through the public consciousness, reshaped by time, retold in fragments, absorbed into a wider understanding of how fragile normal life can be. Emily Carter's case reached that moment slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day it was no longer just a memory of a crime, but a reference point, a quiet warning embedded in the rhythm of everyday existence. The shock had faded, the urgency had dissolved, but what remained was deeper, less visible, and far more enduring. People no longer spoke about the details with the same intensity, yet the details themselves had not lost their power. The image of a young woman walking home, the silence that followed, the years that stretched without answers, and then the sudden collapse of that silence into revelation. It formed a pattern that felt disturbingly complete, a sequence that could be understood from beginning to end, and yet still resisted being fully accepted. Because understanding what happened is not the same as understanding how it could happen so quietly, so close, without interruption. The phrase "forgotten clue" began to carry its own weight in discussions about the case. It was repeated in documentaries, in articles, in conversations that sought to explain how something so critical could remain hidden in plain sight for years. But the truth behind that phrase was more complex than it seemed. The clue had not been forgotten in the sense of being ignored. It had been seen, processed, and dismissed because it did not fit. It did not align with the expectations of the investigation at the time. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part of all, that the truth can exist openly, visibly, and still remain unrecognized simply because it does not match what people are looking for. This realization began to influence not just how past cases were viewed, but how new ones were approached. Investigators became more cautious about dismissing anomalies, more willing to revisit what had already been reviewed. There was an understanding, reinforced by Emily's case, that clarity is often constructed slowly, that meaning can shift as context changes, that what appears insignificant in one moment can become central in another. It was not a complete transformation, but it was a shift, subtle and persistent. For the public, the case settled into a different kind of awareness. It was no longer a story to follow, but a story to remember. It appeared in lists of cases that had taken years to solve, in discussions about justice delayed, in reflections on how technology had changed the landscape of investigation. But beyond these formal references, it lived in quieter ways, in the way people interpreted certain situations, in the instinctive reactions that are shaped not by direct experience, but by the knowledge of what has happened before. There was something about the simplicity of the case's beginning that made it particularly difficult to forget. There was no elaborate setup, no unusual circumstances, no dramatic warning signs. Just a normal evening, a routine walk, a moment that should have passed without consequence. That simplicity made the outcome feel closer, more immediate, as if it existed just beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for a single shift to bring it into focus. As time continued, the story began to fragment, not in accuracy, but in emphasis. Different retellings focused on different aspects. Some highlighted the investigation, the persistence that led to the reopening of the case, the technological advancements that made new analysis possible. Others focused on the human elements, the years of waiting, the emotional toll, the moment when uncertainty was replaced by knowledge. And some returned again and again to the same point, the moment captured in those 3 words, the instant when awareness intersected with danger. That message, simple and incomplete, remained one of the most haunting elements of the entire case. It was not just what it said, but what it represented. It marked a transition, a shift from normality to something else, something irreversible. It was the closest anyone would come to experiencing that moment alongside her, the final connection to a point in time that could never be revisited or fully understood. For those who studied the case in depth, there was a recognition that it contained a kind of structural clarity that many cases lack. A clear beginning, a prolonged middle filled with uncertainty, and an eventual resolution that tied the elements together. But within that structure, there remained gaps, spaces where certainty gave way to interpretation, where facts existed without full explanation. These gaps did not weaken the case. They defined its limits, marking the boundary between what can be known and what cannot. In the years that followed, new cases emerged, some solved quickly, others stretching into their own long periods of uncertainty. Each one carried its own details, its own context, its own set of challenges. But occasionally, when a case showed signs of stalling, when evidence seemed insufficient, when leads ran out, someone would mention Emily Carter. Not as a direct comparison, but as a reminder that time does not necessarily close the door on truth, that answers can exist beyond the initial scope of an investigation, waiting for the right moment, the right perspective, the right combination of factors to bring them into view. The city itself, unchanged in its constant motion, continued to hold the story, without acknowledging it. People moved through the same streets, past the same locations, lived their lives within the same framework of routine and unpredictability. There was no visible trace of what had happened, no sign that the ground beneath certain places had once concealed something hidden for years. And yet, for those who knew, who remembered, the absence of visible evidence did not erase the presence of history. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the resolution of a long unsolved case. It is not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of completion, of something that no longer demands answers because the answers have been found. But within that silence, there is also an echo, a residual presence that continues to resonate, not loudly, not insistently, but persistently enough to be felt. Emily's case existed within that space, resolved but not forgotten, complete but not closed in any emotional sense. And perhaps that is where the story ultimately settles, not in the moment of the verdict, not in the details of the investigation, but in the space that follows, where knowledge replaces uncertainty but does not erase the impact of what has been revealed. It becomes part of a larger understanding, a quiet awareness that shapes perception in ways that are not always immediately visible. Because what this case revealed was not just the identity of one person or the sequence of one event, but something broader, something more difficult to define. It revealed how easily the extraordinary can exist within the ordinary, how quickly a moment can shift from routine to irreversible, how long the truth can remain hidden even when it is close enough to be seen. It showed that resolution is not the same as erasure, that even when a case is solved, it continues to exist in the way it is remembered, in the way it influences, in the way it lingers. The rain falls again, as it always does, touching the same streets, the same surfaces, the same quiet spaces where nothing appears out of place. People pass through without noticing, without thinking about what has come before, without considering the layers of history beneath their steps. But the story remains, carried not by the environment, but by memory, by awareness, by the subtle understanding that something once happened here that changed everything for someone, and in doing so, changed something for everyone else as well. And so the narrative continues, not as an active story, not as something unfolding, but as something that exists, complete yet unresolved in its deeper meaning. A reminder that even when the truth is uncovered, even when the case is closed, the impact does not end. It settles, it lingers, it becomes part of the invisible fabric of understanding that shapes how the world is seen, long after the final headline has been written and the last word has been spoken. In the end, what remains is not the noise of the headlines or the intensity of the courtroom, but the quiet persistence of a story that refuses to dissolve completely into the past. Emily Carter's case, once defined by absence and uncertainty, now exists as something fully formed, yet never entirely settled. It lives in the spaces between memory and reality, in the subtle shifts of awareness that people carry with them without always recognizing their source. It is no longer unfolding, no longer searching for answers, and yet it continues to move, to echo, to shape the way certain moments are understood. There is something uniquely unsettling about a case that begins in such an ordinary way. No warning signs, no dramatic escalation, no clear indication that anything is about to change. Just a routine, a familiar path, a sequence of events that could belong to anyone. That simplicity is what gives the story its lasting weight. It suggests that the boundary between safety and danger is not always visible, not always marked by clear signals, but can exist within the same space, separated only by a moment that cannot be predicted or reversed. Over time, the details of the case have settled into a kind of collective memory, not always recalled in full, but present in fragments that surface unexpectedly. A passing thought when walking alone at night, a brief hesitation before responding to an unfamiliar presence, a recognition, however faint, that certain situations carry layers that are not immediately visible. These reactions are not driven by fear alone, but by awareness, shaped by stories like this one that demonstrate how quickly circumstances can shift. The investigation itself, once the central focus, has become part of the background, its complexity understood in hindsight but no longer actively examined by most. Yet for those who look closely, it remains a study in persistence, in the importance of revisiting what has been set aside, in the realization that truth is not always revealed in a single moment, but constructed over time through attention and reconsideration. The overlooked footage, the dismissed witness, the fragment of a message, these elements form a pattern that extends beyond this case, offering insight into the nature of inquiry itself. And still, despite all that has been uncovered, there is a sense that something remains just beyond reach. Not in terms of facts, which have been established, but in terms of meaning, of understanding the deeper layers that do not translate easily into evidence or testimony. What drives a person to cross that invisible line? What transforms a passing thought into a decisive action? These are questions that remain, not because they lack answers, but because the answers do not fully satisfy the need to understand. Emily's final message continues to resonate, not because it provides information, but because it captures a moment that cannot be extended or explained. It is a point of transition, a recognition of something that had not been visible before, compressed into a few words that carry more weight than their simplicity suggests. It stands as a reminder of how quickly awareness can shift, how a single realization can alter everything in an instant. For the city, the case has become one of many stories that form its hidden history, narratives that exist beneath the surface, rarely acknowledged but never entirely absent. London moves forward, as it always does, absorbing events into its vast and complex structure, allowing them to fade into the background while still retaining their presence in subtle ways. The streets where Emily walked, the locations connected to the case, have returned to their ordinary function, indistinguishable from countless others. Yet the knowledge of what occurred there remains, carried not by the physical space, but by those who remember. There is a particular kind of permanence in stories like this, a way in which they resist being fully contained by time. They do not remain in constant focus, but they do not disappear either. They exist in a state of quiet persistence, ready to surface when something triggers recognition, when a detail aligns, when a memory is recalled. This persistence is not intrusive, but it is undeniable, a subtle presence that shapes perception in ways that are not always immediately apparent. As years continue to pass, the case becomes less about the individuals involved and more about what it represents. It becomes a reflection of how systems function, of how investigations evolve, of how human behavior can remain opaque even when examined closely. It is referenced not just for its resolution, but for its process, for the way it moved from uncertainty to clarity, for the time it required to reach that point. And within that process, there is an understanding that resolution is not a single moment, but a series of developments that gradually bring a story into focus. The arrest, the trial, the verdict, these are visible milestones, but beneath them lies a longer sequence of effort, of reconsideration, of details that align slowly over time. This understanding shifts the way such cases are viewed, emphasizing patience, persistence, and the willingness to look again at what has already been seen. For those who encountered the case later, who did not experience its unfolding in real time, it exists as a complete narrative, something that can be followed from beginning to end without the weight of uncertainty that once defined it. But even in that form, it carries a sense of unease, a recognition that the clarity it now possesses was not always present, that for years it existed as a question without an answer, as a space filled with speculation and doubt. That transformation, from unknown to known, is at the heart of what gives the story its lasting impact. It demonstrates that truth can be delayed, that it can remain hidden within plain sight, that it can require time and perspective to emerge fully. And in that demonstration, it offers something both reassuring and unsettling, the possibility of answers and the acknowledgement of how long it can take to find them. The rain, ever present, continues to fall over the city, marking time in a way that is both constant and unremarkable. It touches the same streets, the same buildings, the same quiet corners that have witnessed countless moments, most of them ordinary, some of them not. It does not distinguish between them, does not carry memory in a visible way, but it becomes part of the atmosphere in which those memories exist. And so the story settles into its final form, not as something that demands attention, but as something that endures. A cold case that was once defined by its lack of answers now stands as a completed narrative, yet one that continues to resonate beyond its conclusion. It exists in the way people think, in the way they move, in the way they interpret the world around them, even if they are not consciously aware of it. Because what happened did not simply end with the discovery of truth. It extended outward, influencing perception, shaping awareness, becoming part of a larger understanding that cannot be easily separated from the details of the case itself. It is this extension, this continuation beyond resolution, that defines its lasting presence. And in that presence, quiet but persistent, the story remains, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as something already revealed, already understood in fact, yet still unfolding in meaning, carried forward in the subtle ways that memory and experience intersect, long after the final answer has been given and the case itself has been closed. The case file is closed, stamped, archived, and placed among thousands of others, yet the silence it leaves behind feels louder than any siren that once cut through the London night. The words "cold case solved" echo with finality, but the truth they represent is far more complex, lingering in ways that refuse to be contained within paper or procedure. Because even when justice arrives, it does not erase what came before, and it does not quiet the questions that were never meant to have simple answers. It begins again, Not at the moment of discovery, not at the arrest that shocked the city, but in the fragile space where everything still seemed ordinary, where Emily Carter was simply another face in the rhythm of London life. A routine commute, a familiar route, the quiet confidence of repetition. Nothing in those early hours suggested disruption. Nothing indicated that this would become a headline, a cold case, a story that would stretch across decades. And yet, that is always how these stories begin, with a normality so complete that it conceals the fracture about to form beneath it. The disappearance, when it came, was abrupt, disorienting, and impossible to process in real time. One moment present, the next gone, leaving behind only fragments, small inconsistencies that would later become the foundation of an investigation. The last sighting, the unanswered message, the subtle shift in routine that no one could explain. These were not dramatic clues, not the kind that immediately demand attention, but they carried within them the weight of something unresolved, something that would not settle into a logical pattern. The community felt it before it understood it. A quiet unease spreading through conversations, through the way people looked at familiar streets with unfamiliar caution. The idea that something could happen here, in a place defined by its predictability, created a tension that did not fade quickly. It lingered in the background, shaping behavior, altering perception, turning ordinary moments into something slightly more uncertain. The investigation moved forward with urgency, driven by the need to restore clarity, to reconstruct a sequence of events that had been disrupted. Officers followed leads, collected statements, analyzed timelines, each step building toward a picture that never fully came into focus. There were suspects, there were theories, there were moments when it seemed the answer was just within reach, but each time, something slipped, something failed to align, and the case drifted further into ambiguity. And then, the slow transformation began, almost imperceptible at first. The intensity of the early days gave way to a quieter persistence, a steady effort that continued even as public attention shifted elsewhere. The case did not end, but it changed, moving from the forefront into the background, from urgency into endurance. It became a cold case, a term that carries with it a sense of distance, of time passing without resolution, of a story waiting in suspension. Years accumulated, each one adding a layer of separation between the event and the present moment. New cases emerged, new headlines captured attention, and Emily's story became one of many, referenced occasionally, remembered by some, but no longer dominating the narrative. Yet it never disappeared completely. It remained in records, in conversations, in the quiet determination of those who refused to let it fade entirely. And it was within that persistence that the turning point emerged, not as a sudden revelation, but as a rediscovery. A detail once overlooked, a piece of evidence that had been present from the beginning, but not fully understood. It did not stand out at first, did not announce itself as significant, but when examined again, in a different context, it began to shift, to reveal connections that had not been visible before. The forgotten clue, small and easily dismissed in the chaos of the original investigation, became the key to everything that followed. It redefined timelines, recontextualized witness statements, and pointed in a direction that had not been fully explored. What had once seemed like a minor inconsistency now carried weight, now demanded attention, now opened a path that had remained hidden for years. From that moment, the case accelerated, moving with a clarity that had been absent for so long. Investigators revisited old evidence with new understanding, re-examined relationships, reconstructed events with a precision that had not been possible before. The pieces began to align, forming a narrative that was both shocking and inevitable, as if it had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The arrest, when it came, sent a shockwave through the community, a sudden return of a story that many had placed in the past. The name, the connection, the realization that the truth had been so close, so embedded within the original investigation, created a sense of disbelief that was difficult to process. It was not just the resolution that stunned people, but the way it had been reached, through something so small, so easily overlooked. In the courtroom, The case unfolded with a different kind of intensity, one that replaced uncertainty with evidence, speculation with fact. The narrative that had taken years to construct was presented in full, each detail contributing to a picture that could no longer be questioned. It was a moment of clarity, of finality, but also of reflection, as the long path to this point became visible in its entirety. And yet, even as the verdict was delivered, even as the case reached its official conclusion, the deeper impact remained. Because resolution does not erase the years of not knowing, does not remove the weight of time that has already passed. It does not return what was lost, does not restore the moments that were taken, does not fully answer the question of why. For the community, the case became something more than a story, more than a headline. It became a reference point, a reminder of how easily certainty can be disrupted, how quickly normality can shift into something unrecognizable. It influenced the way people moved through their environment, the way they interpreted small details, the way they understood the balance between routine and unpredictability. For investigators, it became a lesson in persistence, in the importance of revisiting what has already been seen, in the recognition that answers do not always emerge immediately, but can exist quietly within the details, waiting for the right perspective to bring them into focus. It reinforced the idea that no case is ever truly closed until every possibility has been examined, every clue considered, every angle explored. And for the story itself, it became something that extends beyond its conclusion, a narrative that continues to resonate even after the final chapter has been written. It exists not just in records or reports, but in memory, in awareness, in the subtle ways that people carry it forward without always realizing it. Because what happened in London in 2003 did not end with the arrest, did not conclude with the verdict. It continues in quieter forms, in the way it has shaped perception, in the way it has altered understanding, in the way it has become part of a larger narrative about time, truth, and the persistence of unanswered questions. The rain falls again, as it did then, as it has countless times in between, marking the passage of time without distinction. It touches the same streets, the same spaces, the same places where moments once unfolded, where events once disrupted the ordinary. It carries no memory, no trace of what has happened, and yet it becomes part of the atmosphere in which those memories exist. And so the story remains, not as an open question, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as something completed and yet still unfolding, a reminder that even when the truth is known, its impact does not end, but continues, shaping the way the world is seen, long after the case itself has been closed, long after the final word has been spoken, long after the silence has settled back into place, leaving behind only the echo of what once was and the understanding of what it has become. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded into the background noise of newer stories, the case refused to settle into something distant or fully resolved. It lingered in a quieter, more persistent way, not through constant attention, but through the subtle awareness it left behind, like a shadow that no longer moves but never completely disappears. Because what had been uncovered in the end was not just a sequence of events, not just a name attached to a crime, but a realization that something so close, so ordinary, had concealed a truth that remained hidden for years. It returns again and again to the smallest details, the ones that seemed insignificant at first, the ones that were recorded, filed, and then set aside because they did not immediately connect to anything larger. A passing glance captured on outdated footage, a timestamp that did not quite align, a fragment of a conversation remembered imperfectly. These details, once overlooked, now carry a different weight, a sense of importance that transforms them from background noise into defining elements. They are no longer just parts of a larger puzzle. They are the pieces that held everything together, unnoticed until the moment they were seen in the right way. There is something unsettling in that realization, something that extends beyond the case itself. It suggests that understanding is not always about finding new information, but about reinterpreting what is already there, about looking again at what has been dismissed, about recognizing patterns that only become visible with time. It challenges the idea of certainty, replacing it with a quieter, More complex awareness that even the most thorough investigation can leave something behind, something that only reveals itself when circumstances change. For those who followed the case from the beginning, the resolution did not feel like an ending, but like a shift, a movement from one form of uncertainty into another. The question of who had been answered, the sequence of events established, the narrative completed in a way that satisfied the demands of justice. And yet, beneath that clarity, there remained a deeper layer of unease, a recognition that the years of not knowing could not simply be erased, that the time spent searching, questioning, waiting, had left its own mark. For others, those who encountered the story only after it had been resolved, it exists as something more contained, more defined. A beginning, a middle, an end. A disappearance, an investigation, a revelation. It can be followed, understood, and absorbed without the weight of uncertainty that once defined it. But even in that form, it carries an undercurrent of something unresolved, a sense that the clarity it now possesses was not always present, that it was built slowly, through persistence and reconsideration. The idea of a forgotten clue becoming the key to everything continues to resonate, not just as a detail of the case, but as a broader reflection of how easily critical moments can be overlooked. It forces a reconsideration of what is considered important, of how attention is directed, of how decisions are made in the absence of complete information. It highlights the fragility of conclusions, the way they can shift when a single element is reintroduced, when a detail once dismissed is brought back into focus. And within that, there is a quiet acknowledgement of how much depends on perspective, on timing, on the ability to see beyond what is immediately obvious. The same piece of evidence can exist in two different states, one where it is ignored, another where it becomes central, depending entirely on how it is viewed. This duality is what gives the case its lasting depth, its ability to remain relevant even after it has been resolved. The streets of London continue to move with the same rhythm, the same flow of activity that existed before, during, and after the events that define this case. People pass through the same spaces, follow the same routes, engage in the same routines, often unaware of the layers that exist beneath the surface. And yet, for those who know, for those who remember, those spaces carry an additional dimension, a sense of history that is not visible, but is nonetheless present. There is a particular stillness in places where something significant has occurred, not a physical change, but a shift in perception, a recognition that what appears ordinary can hold something far more complex. This stillness does not announce itself, does not interrupt the flow of daily life, but it exists, quietly shaping the way certain moments are experienced, the way certain details are noticed. As time continues to pass, the case becomes less about the specific individuals involved and more about what it represents, about the broader implications it carries. It becomes a point of reference, a story that is told and retold, not just for its details, but for the way it illustrates the persistence of truth, the importance of attention, the reality that answers can exist even when they are not immediately visible. And still, there is something that remains just beyond complete understanding, not in terms of facts, but in terms of meaning. The actions that led to that moment in 2003, the decisions made, the thoughts that were never recorded, the motivations that can only be inferred. These elements resist full explanation, not because they are unknown, but because they exist within a space that cannot be entirely captured by evidence or testimony. This is where the case continues to live, not in the official records, not in the conclusions that have been reached, but in the questions that extend beyond them, in the reflections that arise when the story is considered from different angles. It is in this space that the narrative remains active, not as an unresolved mystery, but as something that continues to provoke thought, to challenge assumptions, to remind those who encounter it that understanding is never as simple as it appears. The final image is not one of resolution, not of closure in the traditional sense, but of continuity, of a story that has reached its conclusion in one way while continuing in another. It is carried forward not through headlines or broadcasts, but through memory, through awareness, through the subtle ways in which it has become part of a larger understanding. Because in the end, what defines this case is not just the fact that it was solved, but the way it was solved, the time it required, the details that were overlooked and then rediscovered, the persistence that brought it back into focus. It is a reminder that truth does not always emerge quickly, that it can remain hidden within the familiar, within the ordinary, within the very details that seem least significant. And so it remains, not as a question waiting for an answer, but as an answer that continues to generate questions, a completed story that refuses to feel entirely finished, existing in that quiet space where memory and meaning intersect, where the past continues to influence the present, where the echo of what happened in London in 2003 still lingers, not loudly, not insistently, but with a persistence that cannot be ignored, shaping perception, shaping awareness, long after the final chapter has been written and the case itself has been closed. There is a moment, long after everything has been said and recorded, when the story stops belonging to the case file and begins to exist entirely in the minds of those who carry it forward. It is no longer bound by evidence or procedure, no longer limited to the sequence of events that can be proven or documented. Instead, it becomes something more elusive, something shaped by reflection, by memory, by the quiet realization that even a solved case can leave behind a presence that refuses to fade. It settles into the city in ways that are almost impossible to trace. Not through visible markers or official acknowledgments, but through subtle shifts in awareness, in the way people interpret silence, in the way they notice small inconsistencies that might once have been ignored. It becomes part of an unspoken understanding, a reminder that what is seen on the surface is not always complete, that the ordinary can conceal something far more complex. The name Emily Carter no longer appears in headlines, no longer triggers the immediate recognition it once did, but it has not disappeared. It exists in quieter forms, in conversations that surface unexpectedly, in moments when the past intersects with the present in ways that are difficult to explain. It is not constant, not overwhelming, but it is there, a subtle thread woven into the larger fabric of the city's memory. And within that memory, the details remain, not always in their original form, but reshaped by time, by perspective, by the way they are recalled and retold. The night of the disappearance, the unanswered message, the overlooked clue that changed everything, these elements persist, not as isolated facts, but as part of a narrative that continues to evolve even after its conclusion has been reached. There is something inherently unsettling about that evolution, about the idea that a story can be complete and yet still change, still take on new meaning as it is revisited. It suggests that resolution is not an endpoint, but a transition, a movement from one form of uncertainty into another, from not knowing what happened to questioning what it means. For those closest to the case, this transition is not abstract. It is deeply personal, rooted in the years of waiting, of searching, of holding on to fragments of hope that may or may not have had a foundation. The resolution provides answers, but it does not erase the time that passed without them, does not undo the impact of those years, does not return what was lost. For the wider community, the impact is different but no less significant. The case becomes a reference point, a story that influences perception, that shapes the way certain situations are understood. It lingers in the background, not demanding attention, but ready to surface when something triggers recognition, when a detail aligns, when a moment feels just slightly out of place. This is how stories like this continue, not through constant retelling, but through quiet persistence, through the way they integrate into the broader understanding of how the world works. They become part of a collective awareness, a set of experiences that inform how people interpret what they see, what they hear, what they feel. And yet, even within that awareness, there is a limit to what can be fully understood. The motivations behind the actions, the thoughts that led to that final moment, the decisions that set everything in motion, these remain partially obscured, not because they are unknown, but because they exist within a space that cannot be entirely accessed or explained. This is the final layer of the case, the one that remains even after everything else has been resolved. It is not a gap in the narrative, not a missing piece of evidence, but a recognition that some aspects of human behavior cannot be fully translated into a clear and complete explanation. They can be described, analyzed, contextualized, but they cannot be entirely understood. And so the story reaches its true conclusion, not in the courtroom, not in the official records, but in this space of partial understanding, where facts and meaning intersect without fully aligning. It is here that the case continues to resonate, not as a mystery, but as a reflection, a reminder of the complexity that exists beneath even the most straightforward narratives. The rain falls again, steady and indifferent, touching the same streets, the same buildings, the same quiet corners that have witnessed countless moments, most of them unnoticed, some of them unforgettable. It does not distinguish between them, does not carry memory in a way that can be seen, but it becomes part of the atmosphere in which those memories exist, a constant presence that frames the passage of time. And time moves forward, as it always does, carrying the story with it, allowing it to settle, to shift, to become something that is no longer immediate, but never entirely distant. It remains accessible, not through urgency, but through recognition, through the way it continues to influence perception long after the events themselves have passed. Because what happened in London in 2003 did not simply end when the case was solved. It extended beyond that moment, beyond the arrest, beyond the verdict, into the ways it has shaped understanding, into the subtle changes it has created in how certain situations are approached, how certain details are noticed. It is in these subtle changes that the true impact of the case can be found, not in the dramatic moments, not in the headlines, but in the quiet adjustments that take place beneath the surface, in the way awareness evolves, in the way people carry the story forward without always realizing it. And so it remains, not as something that demands attention, but as something that endures, a presence that is felt more than it is seen, a story that has reached its conclusion and yet continues to exist in the spaces between memory and reality, between what is known and what can only be inferred. Because even when the truth is uncovered, even when every question that can be answered has been answered, there is always something that remains, something that lingers, something that cannot be fully contained within the boundaries of a case file or a final report. And it is this lingering presence, this quiet continuation, that defines the story in the end, not as a mystery, not as an unanswered question, but as something that has been revealed and yet still resonates, still influences, still exists in the subtle ways that memory and meaning intersect, long after the final chapter has been written, long after the last word has been spoken, leaving behind only the echo of what once was and the understanding of what it has become.